Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My talk is actually very simple, and it is this. I can summarize it in a few sentences. First, compared to other parts of Asia, Hong Kong is relatively free from political torture. Second, we are free from political torture, not because this is a paradise of liberty, but because there are institutions which helps us to protect human rights and help us to stay alert. A third point that I'm going to make is that the threat is always there, and the threat is very close at hand. And if we do not keep vigilant, then any of these institutions would start to crumble and fall apart, and the day will not be far off when Hong Kong will see some very unsavory kind of violence. So these are the 3 points that I'm trying to make in the talk, and I will try to go through it by, first of all, a story. Last month, on a day as hot as this, on the 10th of June, 25,000 Hong Kong people marched in the streets. And they called out one name, and the name is Lee Wang-Yang. And this is an activist, rather this was an activist, who was put into prison for 21 years because of his involvement in the Tiananmen Square incident, because he was a labor trade unionist, and he supported the democratic movement, and he was in prison. And he was tortured in prison, and we only found out afterwards how it was done. He was kept in a sort of container, solitary confinement. He was handcuffed with handcuffs which were far too small for him, so that he at once suffered disabilities. He was blinded. His teeth were knocked out because he tried to go on a hunger strike. And so when he was released from prison at long last at the beginning of this year, one of our reporters went to interview him and asked him whether he was sorry, whether he ever felt sorry that he had taken such a tough part, that he was not sentenced all at once to 21 years. But sentence after sentence was added on because he refused to give in prison. He was defiant. And he said, "I'd rather lose my head. I'd rather they chop off my head than to repine." He was as tough as that, and that was a man who can no longer see with his eyes. A few days after this interview was broadcast, he was found dead in the hospital room, and standing in front of a window with a cord round his neck, and he is supposed to have hanged himself. He is supposed to have died of suicide. And Hong Kong people will not accept this. They said, he has been suicided. We invented this term. He had been suicided, and we want to know the truth. And because there was silence, because the Chinese authorities refused to give the truth, but rushed off to perform an autopsy on his body, we were told, and afterwards his body was cremated. His sister, who had been looking after him, disappeared. She is said to have consented, but we don't know. She was not there to tell the story herself. Now, during this march, there were elderly people like myself, and there were young people. There were students, and there are students who blindfolded themselves and walked to the sound of the beating of a drum, because they say, we want to experience what it is not to see, so as to identify more with this man. And so there was the international press there, and they asked me, why does this man inspire? Why did this man inspire this march? Why was he so evocative? And I said, because of people's innate sense of justice, that there was injustice committed against this man who was so strong in his conviction that he was prepared to put down his life for freedom and democracy in China. And this inspired them. And this is number one. Secondly, we identify with him because increasingly in the hearts of Hong Kong people, they also see the shadow of oppression, of all sorts of use of force and violence and invasions into the freedom of people of Hong Kong. Now, we had recently come off a scale. In our mini constitution, you know, in 1997, the British colony of Hong Kong was handed over to China. And on the basis of a joint declaration, in it, China laid down points of policy, fundamental policies for Hong Kong. And this was later on worked into what we call a basic law. In the basic law, Hong Kong people's freedom, Hong Kong's separate systems were guaranteed, but at the same time, there was an article in this basic law, Article 23, which requires Hong Kong to enact laws to prohibit acts of treason, subversion, sedition, theft of state secret, secession, wrong political association, and so on. And in 2003, the government under Tong Chee-hwa tried to implement Article 23 by a national security legislation. And Hong Kong people were very, very worried. And they protested against this, and that led to a very famous march of more than 500,000. So why did they march at that time? Because they felt that their freedom was threatened. And because they marched, although immediately it was not said because 500,000 people marched, therefore they withdraw the bill. But eventually they withdrew this bill. So Article 23 legislation was stayed because Hong Kong people made it very clear that they were concerned and they will not accept it. And in 2005, 2 years later, the chief executive who introduced this bill stepped down. Now, is it good news for Hong Kong? Not necessarily so. But this is why we marched in the streets. It shows both our sense of the need to defend freedoms and also the fear that our own freedom may be curtailed. I have said that by comparison, we have no atrocities of the kind of scale in Hong Kong as you find in China. For example, when we marched for Lee Wang-Yang, we were asked, look, there are thousands of people in China who suffer the same fate. Why this one person? So there are many people, but we didn't get to know about them. But when we did know, that is how we responded. Neither do we have the kind of situation I heard that has been discussed earlier in this seminar. But we are not a bed of roses. We had constant fears of, for example, one question which was prevailing for us as lawyers, and that is confession statements. People who are arrested for criminal offenses, and then they are supposed to have made a confession when they are under police custody. We are worried about that kind of thing. Then there are people who are cowered into silence because of fear of violence. One kind of violence is domestic violence. The other kind is the police, the way police handle people who come into their control. One very famous case was that once there were many women who were arrested because they were suspected of being prostitutes, and they were strip searched when there is utterly no need. There were people who protested, who took part in peaceful demonstration. They were detained and they were strip searched. The police force also threatened when there are large-scale demonstrations. Increasingly, we see more police control. tighter security. We see more use of such weapons as pepper spray. In the last July 1st march, we now have this large issue. Now, I think the old one was about this size. The new one is like a mini fire extinguisher. And people were arrested more, there were more scuffles, and the government says that the police are being very self-restrained, so we want to know what it is when the police is less restrained. So all these things are in the background, they are contained, but they are there. I want to tell another story which has to do with Annapolis. This was in March 2009. A man was shot dead by a constable on a hillside slope. And this man was they just saw his complexion was darkish, he's not local, so they assumed that he's a South Asian, but actually he was a Nepalese. And so the idea was that this was a vagabond. He attacked the police. The man was mentally disturbed. The police had to out of self-defense, shot the man dead, and there was nothing wrong with it. But the community will not accept this, and this was not the end of the story. There were a lot of questions asked, and eventually an inquest was held. The inquest took place, took 76 days. The wife, she was represented by lawyers in the inquest and asked questions of the police constable who shot him dead, and asked, cross-examined the expert witnesses and so on. And all with legal aid, because she was not able to afford it herself, lawyers herself, she was given legal aid to represent the family. And now, at the end of the inquest, although the verdict of the jury was that the police officer was not to be blamed, nevertheless, the matter is, I understand, going on to a civil claim. So I cannot comment any further. But what this tells us is that the coroner system we have under our coroner's law, anybody who died under circumstances which are not completely straightforward, there is a duty of reporting. Anybody who is suspected to have died of suicide or died in official custody would automatically require an inquest. So the case of Lee Wang-Yang would not have been able to happen in Hong Kong. But when you see Mr. Limbu, who had this long inquest, it did not come just because it was an operation of the law. It came because the press reported, because there was pressure from every side, from the racial equality lobbies, from the racial minority groups, from LegCo members, from my colleagues, and so on. And so it was brought forward, and it was done to a great deal of public interest. I want to mention a third incident, and that was the visit of the Vice Premier of China, Mr. Li Keqiang, who came to the University of Hong Kong to celebrate his centenary. And he was the guest of honor, and because he was an important man and he was a guest of honor, there was a very tight and massive security all over the university campus. And that raised a lot of questions. The press was interfered with, students who wanted to demonstrate were interfered with, and later on, the university set up its own independent inquiry looking into the whole incident to see whether the university had compromised its own autonomy and dignity, to investigate into complaints of police force. Now, of course, the university was not the only incident, because the Vice Premier went to visit other parts of Hong Kong. He visited a housing estate, for example, and a man who wore a T-shirt with a June 4th logo on him was prevented from going home. In fact, because he lived in that housing estate. In fact, he was forcibly taken away by the police. Some reporters who tried to cover the incident and take photographs, there were some policemen held up a hand to cover the lens of the camera. And all this came under inquiry, and in the end, there was although the police explanation was, oh, we did not try to stop the press from covering the story, but the hand was caught in the camera because he saw a shadow. He thought he was being attacked, so he raised the hand to resist, to fend off the attack, but the hand got caught in this camera. I mean, this story was actually told in Legco. I mean, some people really think they can get away with anything. But a complaint was made to the police complaint committee. Now, there is an internal, if you want to complain about police impropriety, misconduct, and so on, it's investigated by an internal police complaint committee. And so this was strongly criticized because we felt that this cannot be independent, it will not be objective. But there is another organization which is set up by statute called the Independent Police Complaint Council, and this would review the conclusions of the internal police complaint procedure, and then they will form their own conclusions. So all these stories I'm trying to tell you is that compared to what happens in other parts of Asia may be very mild. But I want to highlight that the question of police using force, the fear of police using force, is always there. Because behind closed doors, you do not know what will happen. But what prevents all this from really developing out of hand, in my opinion, is because we have a number of institutions in Hong Kong, some of them left over by our colonial days, which operate to prevent these things from happening. And the first of these I want to mention is the Coroner's Court. We have a Coroner's Ordinance, which we reviewed shortly before 1997 to bring it up to date. We make sure that we put on, as a matter of law, certain kinds of death has to be reported, and it has to be reported to the coroner. The coroner has the power to investigate. The coroner will hold an open inquest. The inquest is public. It is decided by jury. Concerned parties will be represented. The second institution is, of course, the courts. The independent judiciary is very important. Now, why is it? What is the sanction against a confession which results from torture or pressure? And that is, the police, the prosecution always has to prove to the court that any confession against interest is voluntary. And it is the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and they have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Those of you who are familiar with the common law will recall that this is called the judge's rules. I don't think we call them the judge's rules anymore. If you cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt that a confession is voluntary, that it will not be admissible into evidence. The same thing happens with wiretapping. We passed a wiretapping law, but that was because the courts, the government does wiretapping illegally. And then there were litigation against it, and the courts decided against the government. The courts decided that the government's wiretapping was illegal and unconstitutional, and make that declaration so that if they were going to continue to do that, that would be unlawful. Now, so there was, the government had a deadline to pass laws, because under the basic law, you can only do this kind of, you have to have the law to regulate wiretapping, so that if you were to do it, you have to do it lawfully. But there wasn't any law, and so you could not do wiretapping at all, so they had to pass a law in a hurry. Now, against the sanction is that if it is unlawful, it cannot be produced in evidence. So it's no point you're doing any wiretapping if it can't be admitted into evidence. Now, at once you see that these two things depend on an independent judiciary. And it also depends on a government who still consider the rule of law important. They still at least consider that it is important to tell people that they abide by the rule of law, that they abide by the decision of the courts. There may come a time when the government says the courts is only giving you an opinion and we have more important things to do. I hope that will not happen. The third thing is the independence of a legal profession. You have to have a legal profession which is fearless, which is not afraid of putting your case strongly before the courts, to test, to cross-examine if your client's confession statement is put forward and the government, the prosecution says that it is voluntary. Then most important of all is the press. We still have a relatively free press. Not all the press, not every newspaper, every media body is independent and fully use their freedom. But at least we still have a press, because some people will not remain silent. Everybody, to some extent, will have to tell the truth. So, but for the press, many of these stories, including the story of Lee Wang-Yang, will not see the light of day. But because the press is there, because the press report these stories, and they are protected, because there will, any retaliation, this is very strongly guarded. So, for example, when you say that when there is this hand which covers the camera of the reporter, then a complaint is immediately made about it, and this is kept up. The Hong Kong Journalists Association use all the channels they can to voice this complaint until they get the true story. So until they got the police to agree that this was nonsense, that it was not right for them to say that they saw a shadow and their hands got caught in the camera. So the protection of the press freedom is something which is very high in Hong Kong's priorities. And the fifth, we have such institutions as the police complaint organization. We have the ICAC, I need not explain this. We have the Independent Police Complaint Council, and we have the Legislative Council, which is elected, at least half of us are by geographical, directly elected. And so such things will be watched over by LegCo. Strong human rights groups, the government still goes through the motion of making reports to the UN. And then finally, most important of all, Hong Kong still have very strong core values on human rights, equal opportunity, and we have an institution of report and complaint, of making things public so that we guard against these things. Now these institutions have been long established, and so what we have to do now is only to watch over these institutions so that they do not become watered down. We have to strengthen these institutions, and we have to make sure that that these institutions will stand up to the pressure, and will take the pressure off individuals. In other words, you don't have to have an individual does not face this kind of violence alone, but they can go to institutions which will fight for them. However, I have to end on a note which is not at all complacent, and that is that democracy and the rule of law really stand together. These are our fundamental protections. If you don't have an independence of a judiciary, none of these at the end of the day will mean anything. If judges are not fearless, and if judges are not protected, then many judges will have to pay a high price for being fearless. So the independence of the judiciary is fundamental. But without a democratic system, sooner or later, the independence of the judiciary will be eroded. And because Hong Kong had been struggling very hard for democracy to achieve a really democratic government, and after 15 years after the establishment of the Hong Kong SAR, we cannot say that we have secured a progress towards universal suffrage. So that is still a very large question, and we still stand on the feet of clay. We have a great many good institutions which together will help prevent political violence, including torture, but these institutions depend ultimately on democracy, which we have not got yet. Now finally, I think it is just an extra piece of information, and that is the Legislative Council had finally passed an amendment to our immigration law to put into our immigration ordinance a system for torture claimants, the claimants under the Convention Against Torture. But in the course, so that they are given legal assistance in the cause, so as to protect the fairness, the natural justice of the whole system. Again, the government had to do this because they have lost a number of court cases. When the claimants were not given a fair process, they applied for judicial review. The court declared that the government's administrative system does not meet the requirement of the Constitution, and so that is why the government had to change, and they have to amend the law. Again, you can see the judiciary working. This is not a perfect system, but in the course of dealing with this legislation, it was scrutinized in LegCo, something which worries me very much, and I think probably that is not unique to Hong Kong. This must be the case in the United States, in England, and everywhere, because there are so many false claims, and so many people would use this, abuse this kind of system to come to Hong Kong really to get a job and really for economic reasons. There is a great hostility against people who claim that they are tortured. The torture claimants labor under a great suspicion of the community. I don't say that it is not founded on very, very reasonable grounds, but still, even out of 5,000 false claims, you have one person who was really tortured. That person's right has to be protected. And so the community's suspicion resulting in many of my colleagues being not willing to give torture claimants the protection and the fairness that they really require is something which worries me. It is that when we look at our own, the threats to our own freedom, we are very concerned. But when we look at the threats to other people's freedom, in cases where we can do something, we are a great deal less concerned. And I think that although this must be universal, I am not proud that this is also happening in Hong Kong. So perhaps I'll just stop here. Thank you.